Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Intro to Archives Information Studies 650 lecture. We'll be talking about community archives. So here are our weekly topics for this week. We'll be talking about the nature of community archives. We'll be talking a little bit about the role that archives have in community formation among communities and how this might be different with community archives. And we'll also be talking about how do some community archives challenge traditional archival practices. So not every community archive is going to have archival practices and procedures in place that are as much of a challenge to traditional archival practices or are as much of a departure from traditional archival practices as other community archives, but we'll just talk about some examples of how some community archives carry out their activities in ways that depart from how archives have traditionally acted in the past and in a lot of ways continue to act today. We'll be connecting these weekly topics to all 5 of our course learning objectives. So I'll start by looking at some of the different aspects of community archives. So the Zavala article on page 2 has a nice definition of community, any number of people who come together and present themselves as such. And talking about community archives, they talk about how community archives may be the product of the attempts of a community to document the history of their commonality or of their community. An important thing to note, as the Zavala article does, is that an important part of community archives is that community members participate in record-keeping processes surrounding the community archive, and they exercise some level of control. So participation is really key. It is what separates community archives from traditional archives. And so this level of control, this participation by community members is a vitally important part of community archives. The Zavala article notes that communities and community archives can be based around ethnic, racial, and religious identity, gender and sexual identity, economic class, and geographic location. There are some other categories of communities, of course. So occupation, interest. There's definitely like a gamer community, Dungeons and Dragons community, our artistic communities. So this certainly is not an exhaustive list. And oftentimes communities and community archives may be more multidimensional than just existing around ethnic identity or economic class. So it might be, a community of Black people who are Jewish. It might be a community of white people who identify themselves as being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. So oftentimes there are a couple of different criteria that are a part of a community and are represented within community archives. On page 2, Zavala notes that community archives are framed as ways for people in communities to gain control of decision-making surrounding issues of shared history, memory, narrative, preservation, and power. So again, this idea of control and power, and that the community itself is participating in decisions surrounding these different aspects of archiving and archives. So memory, narrative preservation, these are all things we can associate with archives. So again, just to note the importance of community participation in record-keeping decisions surrounding records as a vital component for community archives. On page 358 in the currents chapter, Sheffield notes that community archives could either be a political project to both, or can be political projects that both legitimize the experiences of a group and also a creative endeavor that reflects the group's values. This aspect of creativity as being a part of community archives is something that is fairly unique to community archives. You don't see this as much within traditional archives. So this would be one example of how community archives are different from traditional archives, and we'll talk about some other ways later on in this lecture. And then when you think about a political project that is aimed to legitimize the experiences of a group, again, that makes me think of power. So a political project is one designed to gain power for a person or a community. And with legitimization comes power as well. If other people in society recognize your community as being legitimate, as having a history, as having a set of shared experiences, as having a place within society, then that makes it more difficult for other people within society to exclude and marginalize your group. So this legitimization can be a pretty powerful thing for communities to experience. It can benefit the community itself because it can make the community have more of a sense of belonging and a sense of being a part of society. And it can benefit them in a more exterior way as well, as other parts of society view them as being a part of society and having legitimate concerns and legitimate needs. So again, this idea of power and gaining power through legitimization. Some other aspects of community archives are that they may be autonomous, so they may not have any partnerships with other archives or with mainstream archives. The Zavala article had an example of a community archive that was attached to a university, and some of the community archivists there, one of the community archivists there talked about some of the benefits of having that kind of relationship. Not every community archive feels comfortable with having those kinds of relationships, however. For instance, the Queer Zine Archive Project here in Milwaukee is very reluctant to enter into any kind of relationships with other organizations, even to the extent where they don't want to apply to be a nonprofit because they feel like that would result in a certain level of exterior control that they just aren't comfortable with. It'll vary from community to community and from context to context. So there is a lot of variety in the autonomy of community archives. Participatory, so this is a pretty necessary component to community archives, as I talked about before. So, you know, if people aren't participating in record keeping decisions, then it kind of takes the community out of community archives. So participation by community members is very important. And we'll talk about some of the issues associated with the participatory nature of community archives a little bit later on in this lecture. Are community archives DIY or do-it-yourself? Again, that is going to kind of range from community archive to community archive. Again, some of them may have exterior support and exterior help. So that may be less sort of do-it-yourself than more autonomous community archives. Relate to social justice, again, I think that you can say some community archives are more directly related to others. If it's a community archive that is related to, say, like a community of people that enjoy video games or even a particular video game, this isn't necessarily a group that has been disempowered or marginalized in the past necessarily. If it is a community archive related to Black people who are transgendered, which is a group that has faced discrimination and all sorts of negative experiences historically and even to this day, then that may be more related to that community seeking legitimization and seeking to write their own story and represent themselves instead of being represented by other people. So again, you can kind of see a whole spectrum of community archive relationship to the concepts of social justice, which we've talked about earlier on in this course. Our community archives again, it's sort of your mileage may vary question. I think that it really varies on how the person answering this question views the legitimacy of a community archive and how they view the practices that a community archive may engage in. And if they feel like a community archive engages in practices that for the most part resemble what archiving typically is and how archiving has typically been done, then they might say, okay, yes, this is close enough for me to consider it an archive. If it is a community archive that doesn't really engage in these practices and doesn't really facilitate activities that people associate with archiving, such as preservation, increased access, arrangement, description, and so on, then they might say, well, no, I don't really consider this to be an archive. It might be something else, but I don't really consider it to be an archive. And a lot of community projects or community members might not even want to think of what they do as an archive. They may want to they may want to call it something else. They may have negative associations with archives and the role that archives have played in the past of marginalizing and disenfranchising people, which we talked about earlier on in the semester, and they may not want to. They may not want to be associated with that. So they may call themselves something else, like a community memory project, or it'll just vary from community to community. So again, yes and no. Yes and no is really the answer to all these questions. It's just important to recognize the variability of community archives and how community archives will sort of correspond with each of these characteristics of community archives. Okay, so related to this idea of social justice, we talked about some of the things that social justice strives for in a previous lecture. So we talked about how social justice strives for things like full human recognition, the just redistribution of power or distribution of power, full and equal participation, an acknowledgement of historic inequalities, and strives against dominance, disrespect, marginalization, exclusion, and non-recognition. And again, how well community archives address these issues or how well they even seek to address these issues will vary from community to community. A community that feels like it hasn't been recognized by other parts of society, a community that feels like it might have been disrespected and marginalized by other aspects of society, may feel like community archives are something that can help them achieve full human recognition. And they may feel that with that full recognition comes, or will hopefully come, a more fair distribution of power. And also more full and equal participation. So again, it goes back to this idea of participation and participation in record-keeping decisions. And that is certainly something that that is strongly associated with community archives. The idea that instead of a community being represented in archival records by archivists who may have no connection to a community or very superficial knowledge of a community, record-keeping decisions would be made by actual members of that community who know more about the community, who know how the community should be described, who know what records are important to the community, and at least ideally are able to provide a more nuanced and accurate portrayal of that community to the public. And in a lot of ways, community archives are acknowledgements of historic inequalities. They are acknowledgements that looking at the archival side of things, that there are gaps in archives, that archives have not attempted to collect and provide access to records that are relevant or that document all parts of society. And so in a lot of ways, community archives emerge as ways to remedy this inequality and to remedy this kind of silence. So on a baseline level, there is a fair amount of connection between community archives and some of these ideas of acknowledging inequalities, of encouraging participation, of redistributing power, of having a more fuller recognition of different groups within society. But you could make the argument that some of these are going to be more relevant for some communities and some community archives than other communities and other community archives. Okay, so next we'll talk about kind of the tricky question of what role do archives have in memory formation among communities? And this role can either be a negative role or it can be a positive role. And how archives engage with communities and how they work with community members when collecting and providing access to community materials is going to go a long way towards determining whether or not the role that archives play in memory formation among communities is a positive one or is a negative one. So it can either be a situation where archives either don't collect records related to communities because they just don't consider them important, or they don't even think to seek out records related to different communities in society, or they do collect records, but the record keeping decisions that they make surrounding these records results in a picture of a community that is inaccurate and may even be harmful. So for instance, if archives collect records of a community and uh, say they collect records of people or organizations that they think are important within a community, but those people or organizations actually weren't that important or that significant to a community at all. So that may lead the community itself, and that may lead people on the outside to misunderstand a community and a community's history. If archives arrange and describe records in a way that that may be harmful, that may result in descriptions of a community or of community members that is incorrect or maybe outdated, then that can have a negative impact on communities. If archives preserve records in a way that isn't that doesn't correspond to community cultural values or community wishes, that can be harmful for the community as well. So that's sort of one side of how this memory formation can occur. A way in which archives remain relatively separated from communities and don't really consult with community members or consider the needs of communities when making record-keeping decisions. Another side, or the other side of what this memory formation can take is one that the Cowan article talks quite a bit about. So one in which there is a strong consultation between community members and between an archive that seeks to represent their experiences. And this can be particularly important because oftentimes, as the Cowan article notes, community records may document intimate experiences of community members. Community archives or community records may to some degree put community members at risk if those records are accessed by people who don't respect the community or want to harm the community. And because of the access that archives have typically triumphed, and a little bit of an unwillingness among archives to put measures in place that restrict access, community members can suffer from access to records by people who, again, may not have the best wishes of the community in mind. And so the Cowan article really emphasizes the need for community and mainstream archives both to take steps to protect the privacy of individuals represented in archives. And, this may well include limiting access to certain materials. And so by recognizing the harm that records can have and the power that records have, and consulting with community members to make sure that that these kinds of situations don't occur, archives can have a positive role in memory formation among communities, and not a more harmful role, which might come from disregarding the potential harm that community members can face, or the wishes of the community about who can and can't access particular sets of records. So there's definitely a strong ethical consideration surrounding ideas of access. And this echoes something that the Hamer article talked about in our discussion about legal and ethical issues that archives should consider. It's interesting to think of the repercussions of the erasure from archives of particular communities and particular community groups. So we've talked in this course about how, in many ways, archives have supported and reinforced power in society, and oftentimes this has come at the cost of equal representation in archives of particular people who weren't thought of as being valuable or who didn't have power in society. And we've talked about how archives can sort of authenticate and legitimize groups and experiences, because when a group or a person is represented in archives, people assume that, okay, well, that person must be important, or that person must have some important role in society because archives have chosen to accept these papers and bring them into the archive and provide access to them. And if communities miss out on this legitimization by not being represented in archives, then that can weaken their overall standing or their overall level of power within society. And so it's interesting to think about how this erasure has contributed to some of the things that the Segal article that we talked about for this week, where, you know, essentially people are and were, you know, being murdered. They're continuously being marginalized in society. And, you know, to a certain degree, people just don't care. These people aren't considered as being important enough to really care about what is happening to them, what is happening to their community. It's not important to think about the difficulties that these communities are facing in society simply because they aren't thought of as worth the trouble. And if archives have a negative impact on memory formation among communities and really thwart the process of a rich and nuanced and complex portrait of a community emerging, then that can contribute to the erasure that leads to some of the things that the Segal article talks about. At least I pretty firmly believe that, and that's why I include that reading in this course. It may not be intentional. It may not be something that archives plan on doing, but it's something that archives have contributed to, and it's important that archives think about how they can contribute to memory formation among communities in a positive way, and not in a way that continues to thwart and marginalize people who are typically already facing pretty strong obstacles in society. So to talk about this a little bit more, I have a little diagram here. So you have this sort of foundation of archival records, and on one side you have the records being activated by community members. So community members may go into an archive to learn more about their community, about the history of their community, about the experiences that their community has experienced. And through that process, access memories that can really support a community and a community's sense of identity. So it can really solidify someone's sense of belonging as a Black person who is transgendered. just being able to access stories of other community members and the experiences of other community members can really solidify that sense of belonging and that sense of identity that an individual has. We also have a situation where records might be accessed by researchers who are outside of the community, and they might develop some kind of product based on this activation and based on this research. So this might be a documentary, it might be a book, and so on. And this can also contribute positively or negatively to the identity formation of community members as well. So if it is a product that does accurately and complexly portray a community, then it can have a positive role in framing and supporting the identity of community members. If it is a product that isn't nuanced, that doesn't necessarily portray a community in an accurate or positive light, then it can have a negative effect on the identity and sense of belonging of a community. But really the foundation of both of these processes are the archival records themselves. And so that's why it's so important that the decisions surrounding these archival records and how they're appraised, how they're arranged and described, how they're preserved, are resulting in archival records that are more likely to accurately and complexly portray the community that the archives are related to. And again, this is more likely to occur through collaboration with community members, through work with the community members, or in the case of a community archive, through the community itself making decisions surrounding the care of archival records. So if archives have a positive role in memory formation among communities, then these records are more likely to be nuanced and accurate. And that's going to make it more likely that researchers are going to create a product that is going to be more accurate and nuanced and will support a community and a community sense of identity. If these record keeping decisions are done in a positive way, then it's more likely that when community members activate them, they're going to use those memories or be able to use those memories to develop a sense of identity that is positive and doesn't reinforce stereotypes or other types of exclusion and marginalization that community members have experienced in the past. So again, it all goes back to participation and having participation in record-keeping decisions that surround archival records. And this is something that is more likely to take place in a community archive, but it's also something that can take place in a traditional archive as well. It's not a process that is exclusive to community archives by any stretch of the imagination. It may be one that is more likely to take place in community archives because of the ability that community archives have to kind of question and depart from traditional archival thought and processes, but it's definitely one that can contribute in more traditional archival settings as well. There just has to be the will by archivists to allow that to happen or to support that happening in a fair and equal way. One thing that the Cowan article notes is the idea of restricting access and using that as a tool to support positive memory formation among communities and to support the overall health of the community itself. So on page 127, they talk about how content-specific restrictions on certain materials for certain times and certain users means prioritizing community-specific values and interests. So carrying out these record-keeping processes in a way that has the interests and well-being of the community at mind. And they talk about how this oftentimes runs counter to a capitalist university and platform metrics of maximum exposure and impact. And they talk about how their efforts to implement content-specific restrictions inform their commitment to making a space where strategic forgetting, non-storage, and ephemerality as part of a decolonizing approach to ethical digital research, archiving, and publication. So you could really argue that having decisions surrounding archival records that does support the well-being of the community and does support the formation of positive, affirming and supportive memories by community members is the ethical thing to do, and is one that can go a long way towards helping counterbalance some of the systemic inequalities and marginalization that community members have experienced in the past. So again, this idea that positive memory formation can be facilitated by things like community control of records, community participation, and the diverse reality and perspectives that extend from community control and community participation. And a negative role of memory formation that archives can have is one that is linked to archival control as opposed to community control, archival participation, and a unitary reality or perspective. So just a perspective of one person writing a fine aid and now the perspective of many people within a community contributing their knowledge and expertise about the community and its history and the records in a given collection. And typically this is how archives have acted in the past. They have sought to control every record-keeping decision surrounding records. They have worked to limit participation in these record-keeping decisions and participation in how things are arranged and described, how things are preserved. And that has resulted in a lot of ways in a unitary reality and perspective that is shared in society. Either it's through direct contact with archival materials or through the products of archival research. So this goes back to something that I touched on before, which is how do some community archives challenge traditional archival practices? And that is through some of the community participation that I talked about. So that's something that the Cowan article talks about, is something that the Zavala article talks about on pages 7 and 8. One other thing that community archives may do, as touched on in the Zavala article, is embracing post-custodialism, or the idea that the archives provides access to records, but they don't, quote unquote, own the records themselves. So the Zavala article talked about people would bring in photographs and they would be scanned, and the actual physical photograph would be returned to the person that brought the photograph in. And they talked about how this really helped them access materials that people might have otherwise been reluctant to give up. Because, you know, I'm not taking this from you forever. I'm just taking it, I'm scanning it, I'm providing access to it, but you retain the physical copy yourself. So there has been some discussion of post-custodialism in archives and in archival literature, but I would say it's not something that's widely practiced and it's fairly rudimentary, but it is something that you see more in community archives. For instance, the Southeast Asian Digital Archive practices post-custodialism, so it's a more common idea to come across in community archives than in more traditional archives. Again, there's this idea of involving people represented within records in record keeping decisions surrounding records, which is something that the Cowan article talks about. Co-creating knowledge, allowing people to consent or not consent to have their words, ideas, or works included, and really having a dialogue with people represented within records. That isn't something that occurs as much in traditional archives. Hopefully that's something that is getting better and will continue to get better over time. But since community participation is such a formative aspect of community archives, there's more of a likelihood for those discussions to take place and for there to be more of a back and forth about, you know, what should our presentation of these records look like? And it's again, it's important that archives think about adapting some of these different ideas and strategies that are more common within community archives. To go back to the Hume article on page 176, the author talks about how archivists must stand in defense of those materials that represent historically maligned and socially marginalized groups in their holdings, doing so through an ongoing iterative approach to communication, consultation, and collaboration. Only in this way will the digital environment reflect the true needs and desires of record subjects. So this is really closely tied to what the Cowan article is talking about, and it is a relationship which is more present in community archives and community memory projects than traditional archives, at least for now. The Cowan article really places their practices in opposition to what they call colonizing archival practices of occupation, dehumanization, and theft. They really see what they're doing as a response to practices that put the subjects of records at risk and don't involve consulting them on how their records should be treated. And we can also connect this to our idea of merging or considering organizational records that impact a person to be personal archives that person should have some control over, in addition to the organization maintaining the records. So by having that collaborative process take place, again, community archives, especially the community archives that adhere to or follow the model that the Cowan article is suggesting, are challenging how archives have traditionally operated in the past. Another way that community archives, or some community archives, challenge traditional archival practices is by including types of records not considered to be archival because of their nature and the possible lack of authenticity. And this is something that the Sheffield chapter talks about on page 360. And this is important because these records may be the only ones that portray a community accurately or according to community wishes. If an archive says, oh, well, we don't really want to accept this type of record because we don't feel it's authentic or we don't feel that it's legitimate enough to be in an archive, and that type of record happens to be how community members communicate with each other now or have communicated with each other in the past, then that can result in a lot of gaps in the historical record and a lot of gaps in the understanding of a community, which can lead to some of the silences and marginalizations that we've talked about. But fortunately, community archives are typically less restrictive about what types of records are included in community archives, and they are more open to accepting records which may not traditionally be considered archival, but are nonetheless important tools for memory formation and important portrayals of community history and community experience. Okay, so we'll stop there. Just kind of a brief dip of the toes into community archives. There are a whole host of issues surrounding participation. Just for one thing that I didn't touch on too much, so how do you decide who gets to participate in community archives? How do you decide who gets to make record-keeping decisions about records related to a community? How do community archives support themselves? One way is through partnerships. Well, what are some other options? So there really is a whole universe of other information about community archives out there. But I just wanted to give you kind of a brief introduction to community archives, since this is an Intro to Archives course, and to connect community archives and some of the ideas that community archives may be more likely to promote and adhere to with some of the other subjects that we've talked about in class, such as arrangement and description and social justice and personal archives. I think I touched on preservation and appraisal. So there certainly is a lot of overlap between community archives and those topics. Probably most specifically or most strongly social justice, and to a lesser degree personal archives, but certainly those other topics as well. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about community archives. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and have a great week and stay safe.